you everybody for joining us today for our webinar directed. This one is really directly for advocates, activists, folks who care about the environment, about the world around us, about our ocean, and are curious about, want to learn more about the latest with marine protected areas. And my name's Laura Dehan, and I'm the State Director for Environment California. We're going to spend most of today's webinar hearing from some top scientists who've been looking at our Marine Protected Area Network for many years and have conducted some analysis of their own as well. And they're going to be sharing the latest findings around California's Marine Protected Area Network. But also, we wanted to give you all a chance to take action because right now, action is very much needed from the whole community of ocean lovers and ocean advocates. And so we really wanted to take the opportunity to update you on how things are working with our Marine Protected Area Network and also share the need for more engagement and action to protect our MPA network. So the real background of this is that for the first time ever, as our California MPA network hit 10 years, the 10-year mark, the state conducted an analysis and they launched what's known as the adaptive management process. This is about making sure our Marine Protected Area Network is doing what it was promised to do, which is protect marine life off the California coast. And as part of the adaptive management process, our state allowed organizations like ours to submit proposals to strengthen or make changes to the MPA network. And this whole process has also just raised real questions about what are marine protected areas? How are they working? Are we seeing conservation benefits? How are they handling climate change? And so this webinar should get you some of that latest science. If you have questions, we have some time reserved at the end for a Q&A to get burning questions answered. And we also would love to collect additional questions we don't get to and can follow up with you. And then we have seen a real need for more voices of advocates. And so we have an opportunity for your organization to weigh in to support proposals that will help make the MPA network stronger and also stand up against efforts to weaken our MPA network. And so I will come to that right at the end. And for now, though, I want to introduce our first speaker, the Director of Marine Sciences at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Dr. Ricky Erickson, who is going to share a lot of background info about marine protected areas and the latest science on how they're working. Over to you, Ricky.
Thank you so much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. What I'm going to do is a quick brief on the latest California Marine Protected Area science. Next slide. And one of the things I wanted to start with is why did we create the Marine Protected Area Network? I'm a little older than many, so I was around the first time. But during the 1990s, there were concerns by the West Coast groundfish fishery that was collapsing. And by that point, we had already lost a lot of the large fish in California. By the 1960s, 3/4 of California kelp forest was already in trouble and had disappeared. And the fishing community was raised these concerns to the state and wanted to do many things to protect our California ocean. And so at the time, it was realized that our ocean is not what it was 100 years ago. And today we put the network, the last MPA was put in place in 2012. Today, what we're realizing is we have many new stressors that we may not have anticipated, and our ocean is not what it once was. So next slide. So for those of you, what is a marine protected area? Hopefully most of you know, but this is a graphic. If you look All the way over to the left, you see what the ocean historically looked like. And the idea behind a marine protected area is that you reduce some of the activities that are impacting on that marine area. And so that might be things like bottom destruction, trawling, mining, anchoring, and of course, fishing. And there are very many gradations of the level of protection. So we have fully protected all the way to minimally protected that might do something very different. And those we're going to talk about a little bit later. Next slide, the difference between those. So we designed on behalf of the state, legislators got together and developed the Marine Life Protection Act. And the goal of the California Marine Protected Area Network is primarily biodiversity protection. It's to conserve and protect marine life populations. It's to improve recreational and educational opportunities, and to be designed as a network based on sound scientific guidance. And they smartly put into this piece of legislation that adaptive management was an important role to be able to respond to unpredicted or emerging stressors like we find ourselves with today. Next slide. So I wanted to get a little bit of a difference because there is some confusion about different types of tools for different types of goals. And so marine protected areas, it's a tool that is focused on biodiversity protection. It protects all of the different pieces of the ecosystem. And it's really a conservation tool that addresses both the habitat and the wide array of species. Now, fisheries management is very different, where it is based on maximum sustained yield, often called MSY, and that is focused on protecting fished species or targeted species from overfishing. And it is a fished species tool in the fact that it ignores all the other ecosystem components. Next slide. So these are two very different tools, and I'll also add that marine protected areas are a tool in our toolbox. They are not the only tool. They do not address a lot of threats like there's water quality impacts, and they can be used to leverage to improve water quality, but they have to have those regulations within their boundaries to actually manage it. So the regulations within an area are really, really important. And I mentioned before that California's marine protected areas were designed using a science guidance that was developed by some of the best scientists that we have here in California. And just recently, many of the NGOs got together and we analyzed how well is our network compared to that science guidance. And I think it's important to realize this as we're setting our expectations and evaluating how well they're performing. And what we found is that California's MPAs are significantly smaller and farther apart than those science guidelines. So 90% of the MPAs are smaller, and 70% roughly are farther apart than as recommended. And that's important for that cute little guy that you see there in the middle. That's a fish larvae, and they need connectivity to be able to be born in an area where they're protected, their mothers are protected from fishing, and then to settle out and be able to find habitat that is in a good condition so they grow up and become adults. So they also recommended that it would be 25 years before we would see full benefits from our network to accrue. And right now we're at about 10 years, plus or minus a little bit. Next slide. So what is the condition of California's ocean? What do we know about that? So we know that there are many more stressors that are more frequent and more extreme, such as heat waves, atmospheric rivers causing rainfall that then delivers land-based pollution, plastic pollution, harmful algal blooms, and then we have increasing competition for space and use of our ocean from shipping, and in the future, California may see floating offshore wind. Next slide. So the state of our California ocean, we have a few ways that we can assess that. NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service puts out a report that is called the State of the California Oceans Report. The California California Current Ecosystem Report. And what that report found was that climate change, land-based inputs, fishing pressure, and habitat destruction are the primary unfavorable conditions and risk factors that are increasing and that we're seeing having negative impacts on our California current ecosystem. And they concluded that the resilience, that means the ability of a system to bounce back from, to recover, that we have seen in the past with our California ocean is not likely to be sustained in the future. What they conclude is that we should all expect new normals that will replace historic expectations. Next slide. So then we can look at what the state of California can tell us about the California ocean. And what we realize is that for most of California state fisheries, these are these species that the state of California manages, those that NOAA does not, we realize quickly that 90% of those do not have stock assessments. So therefore, the degree of depletion from fisheries remains unknown. So we really don't have a good indication. What they did find also is that when they looked at landings and the value, the economic value, that those do not appear to be negatively impacted by the California network of MPAs. Next slide. And then our final way of looking and evaluating the condition of our California ocean is the National Marine Sanctuaries, of which we have 4 along the California coast: Monterey, Cordell, Gulf of Farallones, and Channel Islands. This is a stoplight analysis, and they put out condition reports on what is the condition of living marine life in their boundaries, with red being poor, yellow being fair, and green being in good condition. And what we can rapidly see is that the state or condition of our national marine sanctuaries ranks from poor to fair for the most part. And what's interesting is looking at the vulnerability to climate impacts. Monterey and Cordell have not evaluated that, and Gulf of the Farallones and Channel Islands evaluated that their condition and preparation for climate vulnerability is poor. And the majority of the causes, if you look over to the far right, for these conditions based on the National Marine Sanctuaries is shipping traffic, fishing, including destructive benthic or bottom habitat disturbance, as well as increasingly these climate impacts. Next slide. So now let's look back on, we are now in 2022. The network was completed in 2020, or we're now in 2025. In 2022, we had the first opportunity, which is called the Decadal Management Review, to look back and see how well is our marine protected area network doing. So let's take a look at those results. Next slide. So there was a decadal management review that was put together from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the decadal management review shows us that there are bigger, more abundant fish and invertebrates inside protected areas. They found that larger MPAs perform better. They found that the higher levels of protection, the no-take, perform better. That responses to MPA protection are greatest where there's more fishing. Now, there was variability in these responses across habitats and bioregions, but this is the kind of major take-home messages from the Decadal Management Review. And there was also a fisherman or fisher person study conducted that found quite similar findings. More and larger fish, larger MPAs perform better, and they also found more resilient communities, or that fish diversity recovered more quickly inside of the protected areas. And this was with close to 2,000 anglers and catching over 175,000 fish, which, by the way, were all released. Next slide. So now we're going to look at, since the designation of the MPA network, there has been a suite of great new science that provides further insights into what we're seeing. Next. So first, we're going to dive into ecological resilience. How does, or what evidence do we have that protection builds resilience, right? Like, it's, if you're a patient and the doctor says, go home, get rest, take care of yourself, don't drink too much. It's kind of that type of, does protection actually build resilience in the community? Next slide. So what do we mean by ecological resilience? And this is a paper that was published in 2015. And there's three types of resilience. There's population resilience, community, and ecosystem. And what those do together is they create larger and more dense local populations. So you have more individuals, larger sizes, the size structure is replenished, and that's important. I'm going to show you in a minute why. You get greater diversity, and you also get increased genetic diversity. And so these are all ecological resilience and the benefits of protection. And it's important that fisheries management does not confer these types of resilience benefits. Next slide. So why is size and age structure so important? So on the left-hand side, you have a picture of a very happy fisherman catched a lot of very large fish. And on the right-hand side, what you can see is that if you have an individual who is 40 centimeters, that female will produce 350,000 eggs in a year. Whereas if you leave her in the water to 60 centimeters, she produces over 3 million eggs. And since fishing pressure tends to target the larger individuals, it can truncate or reduce or shift that age structure so that you have many more younger, smaller individuals. And you can see why from this graphic that will reduce overall reproductive potential. And we also have interesting science that shows that those larvae or offspring from the larger mothers actually have greater survival rates in the long term. Next slide. So do we have evidence of finding this in California? So these are 3 different studies that are looking in California since we put the MPAs in place. And in the first one in the upper left, we see that fish communities structure inside MPAs did recover faster than unprotected areas. If we look down here on the bottom left, this is a study that looked at deep rocky reef using ROVs, remotely operated vehicles, and they found that the 4 rockfish species recovered with those recovery rates exceeding expectations inside the marine protected areas. And this study to the right, we see that there was higher ecological connectivity led to more stable communities. And so these studies combined show us how marine protected areas can help with ecological resilience for our future. Next slide. So now let's dive into, we have a lot of kelp forest along the California coast. It's very important to us as citizens. And so let's dive into kelp forest resilience. Next slide. So the focus on California kelp is because we saw in the history of how we designed the Marine Protected Area Network that we'd already lost 75% of the kelp by 1960s. And what we've seen since then recently is upwards of 90 to 95% statewide loss of kelp. So if you look here on the left at this image off of Point Arena, you see the yellow is the kelp canopy in 2008. And then you see that kelp is all but disappeared by looking at 2019. And so we have a lot of kelp forest loss. There's a lot of science that's driving into the local factors that are driving kelp persistence and recovery, and it's quite complicated by region, but this is why we're all concerned about kelp forest resilience. Next slide. So what have we found? If we look at, does protection build resilience inside kelp forest ecosystems in California? We have this study looking at on the left-hand side, looking at kelp forest ecosystem dynamics, and it found that both protection and the increase in predators that eat the urchins, which are grazing on the kelp, did increase kelp resilience, and they found dramatically less kelp outside of marine protected areas. If we look in the upper right-hand side, we see that marine reserves has these direct and indirect benefits and effects on their predators and prey, which again is indicative of these ecosystem-wide benefits of protections. And then the study looking at no-take marine protected areas enhance the benefits of kelp forest restoration, but at a small cost to fisheries yields. So there can be overall, like in restoring overall kelp forest production, we can achieve that, but there is a minimal cost to fisheries yields. Next slide. The only long-term study we have that looks at kelp forest resilience over a longer period of time, and this is interesting, looking at 25 years, which is what our scientists said we needed to expect for full benefits to accrue, comes from New Zealand. Now, they had a very similar situation where if you look at the top of this image where it says urchin barrens, their kelp forest ecosystems looked like many of ours in California with urchin barrens, and they put in place full protections. And now, after 25 years, their urchin barrens went to algal turf, to mixed algal forest, and then to full kelp forest. And so this is the best indication. We're not at 25 years in California, but this points to what we think scientifically our hypothesis and our science studies are demonstrating. Next slide. So let's look at the size and age of marine protected areas and the impact of that from what we know in California since we put them in place. Next slide. So this is a newly released study that was actually conducted by the fishermen as well. And so if you look at these bar graphs over to the left, the first one is catch rate, CPUE, and the right-hand one is biomass. So how heavy was that catch? And the bars in red are the protected areas, and the bars in blue are outside of those. And what they found was larger, older marine protected areas had higher observed total catch rates and fish biomass. Next slide. And then I'm just going to talk really briefly about partial and full protections, and because we're going to cover that in a moment. But if we go to the next slide, I showed you kind of the differences in the impacts on marine life. So ecologically, there's a global literature base that shows that many partially protected areas do not perform any better than reference sites or uncontrolled sites. But what I thought was really interesting was that this was a meta-analysis looking at many different marine protected areas around the world. And what they found was people did not understand partially protected areas, and they were not at all perceived to have a better marine life. Next slide. So what can we do with this information for adaptively managing our California MPAs? Next slide. So these are science recommendations from scientists in California and around the world. And the first is to ensure that the science guidelines are met. And as we can see, ours are smaller and farther apart. other ways that we can address this is through replication, making sure we have representation, the size and locations of those, things like protecting climate refugia or hope spots or very, highly productive areas so that we have a source population to seed other parts that might be being degraded. So those little larvae have a place to go. To address other stressors in the system that maybe a marine protected area cannot address, like water quality and other things like that, and to utilize marine protected areas as a tool for those that we can address the local stressors. Next slide. So that's my overview, and what I'd love to do right now is introduce my colleague, a conservation scientist, Jessica McCarthy. She's with the Marine Conservation Institute, and she's going to be talking about applying the Marine Protected Area Guide, a global guide, to our California network. Take it away, Jessica.
Hi all, thank you, Ricky. As Ricky said, my name is Jessica McCarthy, and I'm a conservation analyst at Marine Conservation Institute. I'm going to build a little bit on Ricky's discussion by digging a bit more into the different types of protections that MPAs can provide, particularly those in California, and do this through the lens of a framework that's called the MPA Guide. Next slide, please. The World Database on Protected Areas, or the WDPA, which is shown in the map here on the right, is the official repository of protected area data and currently includes over 16,500 reported MPAs across the globe. While these MPAs are all counted equally toward conservation targets such as 30 by 30, in practice, we know that many of the characteristics of MPAs vary widely, and that can be due to differences like different designation types, political or local contexts, or different pressures in different areas. But this means key components such as their regulations, the types and extent of human activities that occur, the level of compliance with regulations, the capacity to carry out enforcement and management activities, the governance structure, community engagement, among all these other factors can differ in different MPAs. And these differences can be complex, but they're all directly intertwined with the conservation outcomes that an MPA is going to achieve. Next slide, please. In the previous decade, there was a growing recognition that we needed a clearer understanding and better terminology to describe the differences between the different types of MPAs. And we also needed a better understanding of the impacts of these differences. So in 2020, the World Commission on Protected Areas actually called for a methodological approach to understanding specifically the differences between human impacts and activities in relation to biodiversity outcomes. This launched what became known as the MPA project, led by Oregon State University and all of the other key partners that are listed on the bottom of that slide there, which created an international working group of MPA scientists, policy experts, and practitioners to synthesize the existing body on the science of MPAs. They looked critically at what we know about the compatibility of different human activities with biodiversity outcomes, and then created a categorization system for different types of MPAs that are tied directly to the benefits they're likely to accrue. This framework became what's now known as the MPA Guide, which was published in 2021. Next slide, please. So the MPA Guide is rooted, like I said, in the science of MPAs, and it provides a clear and consistent framework for evaluating MPAs to understand their status and the outcomes that they're likely to achieve. It provides a quality metric that links MPAs to those outcomes that can be used in conjunction with looking at the quantity of MPA coverage. So quick understanding of the MPA Guide, it does essentially four things. The first is that it endorses the IUCN definition of an MPA, which essentially means that an area needs to meet the definition of an MPA to be using this framework. Then it evaluates an MPA stage of establishment or the progress it's made toward becoming protected, ranging from it being just a proposal or an idea to a fully adaptively and actively managed area. Then it determines an MPA's level of protection, which is how well the area is protected from human activities. And then lastly, it specifies the likely conservation outcomes that will be achieved from any MPA tied to that level of protection. Next slide, please. An MPA's level of protection is evaluated using a decision tree framework that assesses the impact of 7 different human activities, as shown in the graphic on the left across the top there. So there's mining, dredging and dumping, anchoring, infrastructure, culture, fishing, and non-extractive activities. MPAs with no or low amounts of human impacts are considered fully or highly protected, while those with larger human impacts occurring within their bounds fall to those lower categories. It's also important to note here for understanding that any MPA with industrial scale activities, such as mining or industrial scale fishing, are considered what we call incompatible with the conservation of nature due to the extent of the impact of those activities. Next slide, please. So a multitude of studies across the globe have built a really substantial body of evidence that the effects of fully and highly protected areas. For example, a variety of studies in different locations have found higher fish biomass, organism size, and species richness in fully and highly protected areas relative to lesser or unprotected areas. The evidence for partially protected areas, as actually Ricky was just discussing, with lower protection levels have been shown to produce less, if any, benefits relative to fully protected areas. And studies have also shown that partially protected areas can be more difficult to enforce and understand. Next slide, please. Since the publication of the MPA Guide, Marine Conservation Institute's Marine Protection Atlas team has been working alongside partners to evaluate MPAs using the guide to build a global data set that tracks and visualizes progress toward the global 30 by 30, focusing primarily on those fully and highly protected areas. The interactive maps and statistics on mpatlas.org have created a more nuanced picture of global protection, bringing the quality of protection into focus alongside that quantity value. Well, there's no legend, I realize, on these screen captures. The different colors on the Atlas map on the right are showing the different stages and levels of protection according to the MPA Guide, which, as you can see, is adding more detail to our understanding than just counting all MPAs the same. Next slide, please. From recent studies using the MPA Guide, including an analysis of the 100 largest MPAs, a few of the graphics from which are shown on the slide here, we know that looking at quantity alone tends to overestimate progress. Many of the reported MPAs are either not yet implemented on the water or don't have strong enough protections to generate positive biodiversity benefits. In this particular global analysis, 1/3 of the protected area was found to be that incompatible with the conservation of nature category, meaning that industrial scale activities were still happening. In most cases, this was fishing in this study. Next slide, please. So recognizing the utility of the guide, the state of California has suggested using it to evaluate MPAs for their inclusion within their 30 by 30 goal. So with this in mind, our team applied the MPA Guide to California's MPAs. A brief summary of the results are shown on this slide. We focus our results on the level of protection component of the MPA Guide because all of California's MPAs are at the implemented or actively managed stage of establishment, meaning that they are already in force on the water. This map is showing the MPAs that are both within state and federal waters, but for our purposes, we're mostly focused on the state waters, which are within that 3 nautical mile line from shore. It's almost hard to see in that map because it looks very close from a distance, but right offshore there. If you look at all MPAs of any kind, just over half of state waters fall within an MPA. However, this is pretty well divided among protection levels. Notably, over 2/3 of the area is considered incompatible with the conservation of nature. In this map, that's kind of those large pinkish colored areas. Taking a closer look, we found that a lot of the variation in protection levels aligns with the various different types of MPA designations within California. So I'm going to hone in a little bit more on two primary types of MPAs that make up the majority of MPA area in California. And that's the California State MPA Network and our National Marine Sanctuaries. Next slide, please. Okay, so looking first at California State MPA Network, which is most of what we've been talking about here. This is the network that was designed under the Marine Life Protection Act. Ricky already shared a lot of great information about this network, and the map on this slide is just showing one of the four planning areas, the South Coast planning area. It's tough to show the whole coastline at this level of detail because California has such a big coast. So in the process of designing the state network, there were 5 different types of marine managed areas that were created. But 2 of them, the state marine reserves and the state marine conservation areas, make up the majority of the network. So those are the ones I'm going to focus on. The state marine reserves do not allow for any sort of extractive use and are largely fully protected areas. These areas are likely to or may already be generating the greatest biodiversity benefits. And then in the state marine conservation areas, the state's fishing commission can authorize uses if they will not compromise protection. And this can include commercial and recreational fishing. In practice, the state marine conservation areas have a wide range of fishing regulations, anywhere from no-take areas to allowing large-scale commercial fishing, such as purse seines. Most fall somewhere in the middle, and are either highly protected or lightly protected, which means they're allowing low or moderate impact fishing gears, things like lobster traps, lines, and spearfishing. Next slide, please. Okay, the second type of MPA is the National Marine Sanctuary. So National Marine Sanctuaries, as you might know, are federally designated under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act. There are 5 within California's EEZ, 4 that fall within any part of state waters. All the sanctuaries have some regulations defined under the National Marine Sanctuaries Act, but they might also have sanctuary-specific regulations. All of the sanctuaries in California follow a relatively similar pattern for regulations. And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to use the Greater Farallones here as an example of an MPA guide assessment. You can see on the slide here, just to explain what you're staring at, each of the 7 activities is going down the left that are assessed as part of the MPA guide. And then each of those colored circles represents a protection level. So fully, highly, lightly, minimally, or incompatible with the conservation of nature. And the darkened bubbles tells you for each activity where the regulations or impact of those activities falls. So as you can see, though there are some activities that are well regulated, it's actually the fishing activity, that is making the National Marine Sanctuary what we call incompatible with the conservation of nature. So National Marine Sanctuaries do not directly regulate fishing and instead would have to work with their respective state or federal authorities to create fishing restrictions. Because of this, in practice, fishing in most National Marine Sanctuaries tends to be business as usual and follows the same regulations as the rest of the state or the federal waters that they fall within. In California's waters, this means that industrial scale fishing gears, such as purse seines that are used for squid fishing, are used within sanctuary waters. So since sanctuary waters aren't receiving additional protections from fishing, these areas are unlikely to see the significant conservation benefits without additional restrictions being added. Next slide, please. Okay, so with all this information in mind, I'd like to add a few recommendations to the ones that Ricky already shared. The first is that only the fully or highly protected areas as defined by the MPA guide should be what's counted toward California's 30 by 30 goal. The science tells us that these are the MPAs that are going to have the greatest conservation benefits, and that is the ultimate goal of the 30 by 30 target. The second and third recommendations here highlight opportunities for strengthening the existing network, including opportunities to increase protection on the state marine conservation areas within the state network that are currently at lower protection levels, or to enhance national marine sanctuaries by using overlapping regulations or designations. Although they don't currently provide sufficient protection to biodiversity, you could overlap either durable fishing regulations or state MPAs or other restrictions or regulations to create complementary protections that enable biodiversity outcomes. And then the last two recommendations focus more on managing the network. So even though we focus mostly on the level of protection, it is important to note that the protections are only effective if MPAs are well enforced and managed, which requires sufficient resources like budget and staff capacity. So it's important to continue to ensure these MPAs are well resourced. And then lastly, it's important to monitor and adaptively manage these MPAs, as that's crucial to long-term success. And it is important to highlight that since we have different designation types in this network and different protection levels, those do need to be evaluated separately rather than only looking at the network as a whole, since we know the different protection levels and also environmental factors might lead to different results and different needs. And next slide, please. All right, that's all for me. So thank you for your time. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Sandy Aylesworth, the Director of the Pacific Initiative at NRDC.
Thank you, Jess and Ricky. It is so heartening just to hear how clear the science is at a time when our environmental threats can be kind of overwhelming. It's wonderful just to see kind of the clear benefits of marine protected areas and see them as a viable solution to help bolster biodiversity in certain areas of our ocean. We are going to leave quite a bit of time for questions, and Ricky and Jess will be answering questions, but we wanted to just take a brief interlude to share an action item that those of you who are on the call today can take. Many people are really interested in knowing what they can do to help support a healthy ocean. As Laura mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, right now, California is in the process of considering changes to the Marine Protected Area Network. That is just one of 4 key strategies associated with 30 by 30 for California. But it's 30 by 30 is not driving the process of the adaptive management of the network. And with regard to adaptive management, there are 20 proposals before the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife will make recommendations on proposals, each of these 20 proposals, and then they ultimately will be voted on by the Fish and Game Commission. In terms of the proposals, there are some of them that would weaken the network, and then there are quite a few of them that would strengthen the network, either by improving enforcement or enforceability of existing marine protected areas. There are ones that would expand the boundaries of certain existing marine protected areas. And then there are proposals for new marine protected areas that would help to fill some of the gaps that Ricky shared early in her presentation, where she showed that there is 90% of the MPAs were smaller than what was recommended by the science guidelines. So in terms of an action you can take, we are sharing a letter of support where you have the chance to read the letter. You should, of course, tailor it to whatever feels reflective of your organization's priorities. And then we have descriptions of the various marine protected area proposals, and you could add, you could specify which proposals you are writing in support for. In terms of why this is important, I think one of the biggest challenges of this entire adaptive management process is that it's really hard to translate what we know to be incredibly broad public support for bolstering ocean protections in California to these really sort of in the weeds Fish and Game Commission meetings. So taking action to communicate your organization's priorities on these conservation oriented proposals is a wonderful way that you can engage. And of course, if you're interested in taking more actions to engage, you should feel free to contact anyone on this webinar. And then before turning it over to Q&A, I just wanted to mention that all told, these there are about 10 conservation proposals. those would only add about 2% of state waters to California's MPA network. So we're talking about an opportunity to have a pretty meaningful impact in terms of adaptive management for not a whole lot of area. So again, sort of small changes that the petitioners feel would really bolster the state's resilience to the many changes that California's ocean has already experienced and is expected to experience in the coming decade. And I'll turn things over to Laura now.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy, and to all of our panelists. I think that was a really helpful backgrounder on the science of MPAs. And maybe we can go to the next slide, which is our questions with this adorable sea otter. So please go ahead and put your questions into the chat. And the first question that I have was about the state's 30 by 30 initiative. So I was wondering if there's anyone on here who can talk about how this adaptive management petition process that we talked about, that relates to the California Marine Protected Area Network. How does that interact with or connect with the state's 30 by 30 initiative, which obviously was an executive order by Governor Newsom, and that has also been codified into law by the state to protect 30% of our land and waters by 2030. Is there anyone on here who can take that?
Sure.
Vicky.
I can answer that, Laura.
Great.
Yeah, so there were several avenues. So the state has evaluated that California is currently at 16% protection and wants to get to 30% protection of coast and ocean by the year 2030. So we're minus 14%, and there are different avenues for that. National marine sanctuaries and adding protections to national marine sanctuaries is one. Improving and adaptively managing the marine protected area network is a pathway. There's a pathway for tribal marine stewardship areas where they're working with the tribes. And then there's finally another idea that it's called other effective conservation measures, OECMs, where these are areas not set aside for conservation, but do have biodiversity benefits. So there's 4 pathways, and the MPA adaptive management is one of those pathways.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Ricky. Let's see. One other question that we have here is about the history. I think it was right at the start, Ricky, you shared a slide about the state of California's ocean really being in crisis that precipitated the creation of the MPA network, as well as other rules and regulations around managing ocean resources. And wanted to just see if you can expand a little bit more on that. It's interesting to hear that it was actually fishing interests that initiated some of the big questions about how to save our state's ocean.
Absolutely. So there was the abalone collapse, the shellfish fisheries collapse. The West Coast ground fishery was in trouble, and it was in the papers and very much of a concern to everyone. And we need to do something because this is an economic dependency for Californians. And that is how the MLPA Act, it took several different processes and attempts to create the network. And at the same time, there was also areas set aside called rockfish conservation areas, essential fish habitat areas put in place by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. So different angles came at this problem to solve this problem. And many of the rockfish ground fisheries have recovered, not all of them, but it certainly was perceived as a positive what the state did in response to these concerns.
Okay, that's terrific. And then we have a question from Sam. Tonight at 5 o'clock, there's actually a city council meeting in Laguna Beach. And so the city's going to be weighing in on whether or not to support a petition to expand an SMCA marine conservation area to include the city's southern boundary. And so they were wondering, does anyone on here have a position on that? Is that something that they should weigh in on? And I'm just trying to double check really quick because we do have.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these places, and I think the impetus behind this is that we know that the marine protected areas are smaller in general. I don't know specifically. I could look it up and find out the size of the Laguna area and what expansion. And then when we were talking about kelp forest resilience, and that's something particularly in the South Coast where you have a certain predator base that you know, we fish that predator base that then eats the urchins. And by doing that, then there's no more predators to keep the urchins in check. And so in many places, that's why protecting protecting a particular area from those large predators then allows recovery of kelp forest. And so I think the Laguna Beach area is one of those areas. In addition, you know, as the scientific community is really honing in on this, where there are places where there is healthy kelp forest, because it's really a statewide kind of collapse, but there are places where it is not as bad, say for instance in the Central Coast, where we have a very different predator base and have different sort of forcing mechanisms on what's controlling that the system there. What we realize is that by protecting these high biodiversity, healthy refugia of kelp forest ecosystems, that is the best way to ensure that we have a source population of not only kelp, but all the organisms that rely on the kelp forest to be able to expand when we have recovery in other areas. And if you don't have a healthy place that is protected, then you risk, which as a scientist, we have seen this over and over and over again. And in many places where people do not take action, their, you know, ecosystem is in collapse. Let's just say Jamaica, which I know is a totally different ecosystem, but it's the same sort of forcing mechanisms, and there has been zero recovery. So I think that is why, and I'll also say as a scientist, we understand less than we know. And now all these new stressors that we have to address, you know, is really kind of putting us into overtime trying to understand what the best options are. And so we know the tools that we're talking about here can work in many instances.
Great. Thank you so much, Vicky, for a lot of that context. And also just to circle back to Sam about the Laguna Beach proposal, that was actually put forward by the Laguna Bluebelt Coalition, and it would extend the current conservation area to no-take boundary to improve overall consistency and ease of enforcement, as well as protecting the kelp forest habitat offshore there. And so that is something that we actually included in the letter that we dropped into the link. And so we are supporting that as the broader conservation community. We think that would be a really positive step forward. And so if you have a chance to go to the meeting, we would encourage anyone to show up at that meeting and speak out in support. And also, if you haven't had a chance yet, you can sign on to the letter, and we'll be able to submit that on your behalf to the state leaders who are going to be making that decision in the coming months. So let's see, we have a few other questions in the chat. So one question here is about the marine protected areas that are actually counted as incompatible, and whether or not those count toward our state's 30 by 30 goals. I think it's a bit of a surprise to some people to hear that our national marine sanctuaries, even though a lot of us have kind of thought of that as being a model of conservation, when you evaluate it using the MPA guide, because of how much industrial activity is still happening within the sanctuaries, they actually would be evaluated as incompatible with nature. And And so on this question of, do they still count toward our state's 30 by 30 goals? Jess or Sandy, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think I can take this one. And correct me if I'm wrong, anyone else on here, but my current understanding is that the final decision-making framework for what counts toward the state's 30 by 30 has not yet been released. The draft framework that I believe underwent public comment last year did say that they were going to include fully protected, highly protected, and some lightly protected if they had other benefits such as climate or access benefits. So in that framework, they were not including incompatible, and I don't think it's likely that they will. But like I said, that final framework, I believe is supposed to be released soon, but we're still waiting on it.
Okay, great. Thanks. There's another question here from Pam. How can citizens take action to protect a small area in their own backyards? Like, let's say people are just learning about this adaptive management process that's underway right now, and they have another area of the ocean that they want to see protected. What can they do? And Sandy, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. I would say that a first step would be to look at the map of the marine protected area petitions. There's one that we dropped in the chat, which was one that NRDC, Azul, and Environment California created. And I would just hover around Southern California where you're located, Pam, and then see, here are the petitions that are being considered right now. And then you could select one of the conservation petitions and write a letter in support of that petition. Because those are the ones before the commission. If you're interested in proposing your own area, that is phenomenal. And that would be, I think, a later process with the department and the Fish and Game Commission. So if I didn't answer your question, others should jump in.
Yeah, and I think I would say don't wait for a new petition invite. Like, I do think that now is the time to raise opportunities or places that really deserve protection that you're aware of, with the decision makers who are actively trying to figure out, how do we protect more of our coastline and our ocean. So the folks at the Ocean Protection Council, as well as the Fish and Game Commission, I think would be open to hearing about ideas, even if there's not an official petition process, and could help advise like what to do or how that could be considered. We have time for really one more question, and I have one from Zach. He says, in San Diego, the Point Loma kelp forest is the largest and healthiest kelp bed in our region, and it seems from the data you've presented, it would be more effective to strengthen protections here than to focus on areas where marine habitat has been really significantly diminished. And is that accurate? So Zach, actually, I would absolutely agree with that. And when the opportunity came up, when the state said it would take proposals to make amendments to the MPA network, one thing Environment California and our friends at Azul did was reach out to scientists all around the state and beyond the state to get feedback on what changes might be needed. And one thing that came up was that we needed to protect some of the healthy kelp beds, the most persistent stable kelp forests off our coast. And so the Point Loma kelp forest was definitely one of those that showed up in satellite imagery for decades as being one of the healthiest areas that was really worth protecting. And so that was actually included in the petition we put forward. It's petition 33, and it's one of the ones you can sign up to support today if you haven't already. And feel free to reach out to us if you want to get more involved. So let's see, we have to actually wrap up this session. If your question didn't get answered, please put your info into put it into the Q&A. We can follow up offline. And I wanted to thank all of our speakers and everyone for being on here today. And we will be in touch.